Welcome to the latest podcast in our series, The Danube Dialogues. This comes to you from the Danube Institute in Budapest. I'm the Institute's president, John O'Sullivan, and our guest today is Nigel Farage. Nigel is a broadcaster, a journalist, a politician. Indeed, he's a unique politician because he managed to make his party, a Eurosceptic party, the largest party in the European Parliament shortly before he helped to lead Britain out of the European Union. So, Nigel, welcome. Your CV is a unique one. I don't think anyone could possibly have dreamt it up in advance of the kind of career they would like. But I believe you were interested in a political life, if not necessarily a career, from your days in school. Your school was Dulwich. You're now, I think, probably the most celebrated old boy after P.G. Wodehouse, the great comic novelist. But what was it that interested you in politics in the first place, at school and later?
Well, you're quite right. I was very lucky to be at Dulwich College. I went to 1974, left in 1982. It was a great school. It was a very, very egalitarian school in the sense that 50% of the boys in my year were there on scholarships. They were there on ability. They weren't there just because their parents could afford to pay. So that was one big advantage for me, was that you mix with people from every single walk of life. I never, ever lost the importance of that, particularly when I moved on later on into politics, where I saw this incredible detachment between Westminster and the rest of the country. And when I was there, we had inflation getting up to 27%. We just finished the 3-day week. We had Marxist trade unions running the country. We had a referendum on whether to stay part of the European Union. We had the United Kingdom becoming the sick man of Europe. And then this woman comes along who everybody underestimates, doesn't think she's got a cat's chance in hell. Her name, of course, was Margaret Thatcher. And midway through my career at Dulwich, she becomes the Prime Minister. And whilst it's true to say, she did do some quite brutal things to old, failing industries, she also opened up London from being, effectively a little economic backwater into becoming the leading global financial services centre in the world. So I saw, through my time at Dulwich, a very, very intense period of politics. Not to forget also the Brixton riots of 1981, which took place not a mile and a half from the school. So I saw a very turbulent period in the 1970s, and I was, from a very young age, absolutely hooked on current affairs, hooked on political debate. And I loved at school getting involved in the debating society, getting involved in all sorts of arguments. And they were in the days, John, when you were allowed to offend each other. You could say things that were provocative, whether you meant them or not. And it didn't matter in the sense that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words could never hurt me. What a very different culture we live in today, and perhaps we'll come to that over the course of this conversation. So I was always fascinated by current affairs. I was, from 1978, when Keith Joseph, who in many ways was the intellectual powerhouse behind Margaret Thatcher, and Joseph came to Dulwich in 1978, spoke in the Great Hall of the school. I sat there in the audience and listened. I went up and shook his hand afterwards and met him. And the next day, just shy of 15 years old, I joined the Conservative Party. And I did it not because I was necessarily a conservative, I certainly wasn't a socialist, but I did it because I thought what Margaret was offering was a way of bringing a failing country into the 20th century and modernizing the country and making it fit for purpose. So I suppose, in a sense, the fact that I was backing Margaret all that way back meant that I was a radical, in the correct sense of the word, from the very off. But no, my life's plan, aged 18, was not to have a political career. Far from it. I wanted to get involved in business, in commerce, and I bypassed university because what was happening in London in those early years of Thatcher, the growth of the yuppie, if you remember, and all of those things. And it all seemed so exciting that I wanted to get there as quickly as I possibly could. So I went and I joined a firm that worked on the London Metal Exchange in 1982. And the LME was and still is the primary global centre where non-ferrous industrial metals are traded. I'm talking about copper, aluminium, lead, tin, zinc, nickel, a bit of silver too, perhaps at times. And what that gave me was a job in which current affairs and politics dominated every single day of our lives, because whether a metal's going to have tariff put on it or not directly affects trade and price and everything else. What the macroeconomy is going to do directly affects price. Then, of course, the big debate was the extent to which China perhaps would go from being a somewhat backward agricultural economy into a modern, and albeit with its problems, but a modern industrialized economy. So we lived and breathed politics and current affairs every single day. And I liked that. The other thing that I enjoyed about that commodity market that I was in was the fact that it was truly global in every sense of the word. When the phone rang, and bear in mind, of course, that the London Metal Exchange, open outcry trading, people sitting in a ring, screaming and shouting at each other for 5 minutes until a bell rings. And I remember when the phones used to ring in the box, and it was sort of quite tough to hear because of all the noise going on. But when the phone rang, quite often it was Frankfurt, quite often it was Paris, but more often it was Santiago or Singapore. There was something genuinely global to what we were doing. And it seemed to me that London, with all of its ancient advantages of understanding trade in a global context, was a great place to do it. And what really politicized me, in the sense of wanting to somehow get involved myself in politics, was to see the very Conservative Party that I joined, that I'd supported, that I'd turned out at one or two elections to do a bit of telling for, to see the very same Conservative Party that I'd been part of in the late 1980s signing up to something called the Single European Act. And the idea was that we would become economically ever more intertwined with our neighbours in Europe. Now, look, I was all for doing business and doing trade with our neighbours in Europe, but not if it meant signing up to a rule book that might make it more difficult to do business with a bigger, broader world. And that was in a sense, my first awakening to the fact that the party that I was supporting was going in a direction that I don't think made sense. And that process continued through Britain joining something called the exchange rate mechanism, which happened in October 1990, when we pegged sterling effectively against the Deutschmark. I remember on the day it happened saying that it was cretinous, or to be honest with you, I think I might have used Anglo-Saxon words that were stronger than that, but hey. and again, this party that I'd supported signed up to ERM, got rid of the very leader in November of that year that had perhaps made them a modern political force. And so I watched all these things with growing disenchantment. And then something happened called the Maastricht Treaty, where any pretense that our relationship with Europe was about friendship and free trade, which is very much what my parents' generation thought they were signing up to. This was overt political union. We joined something called the EEC. It had morphed into the EC. Suddenly it was to become the EU. And I watched all of this, and I watched a rebellion going on within the Conservative Party. to try and prevent John Major from pushing this treaty through. And when it failed, I said to myself, there is absolutely no chance of either the Conservative or Labour parties standing up against what was obvious to me then was going to become effectively a centralised, undemocratic, unitary state of Europe. And really, from that moment in 1993, I determined that the only way to beat the system was to fight it from the outside. So that's kind of my journey, if you like, from business into politics. I'd never had any ambitions to stand for local council, to become a member of parliament. I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to be involved in global trade. I found that business. I found the traveling that I did. I loved it. I enjoyed it. London in those days too was a very convivial place to be. Lunch was the absolute centerpiece of the whole day. When I tell people in their 20s now who work in journalism or business about the social side of life in London of those days, I think they think I'm making it up. So I had a very happy, contented life doing that, a young family, but I flung myself into what I suppose at the time looked like a hopeless political battle because I felt something had gone badly wrong.
Well, what you've just described is very interesting. If I can try to sum it up this way, you were converted by Margaret Thatcher to a view of politics and the economy and a new global capitalism, which she and Reagan helped to bring about. But you went on to see that membership of an enclosed European market political economy was somehow inconsistent with that. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, came to see that herself later. But it is interesting that you took the logical results of her achievements and applied them to Europe. Now, let me then ask you this: you made this move. You're still a successful businessman, you're still enjoying life, you're still having a good time, but you've now joined a tiny party. Within about 5 years, you will become a member of the European Parliament representing that party for the southeast of England. Now, my question is, what was that party like? UKIP, what was it like in 94 to 99?
Well, it was led by a guy called Alan Sked. He founded something called the Anti-Federalist League. He's an historian, and I think he sort of thought about the Anti-Corn Law League back in the 1840s, which in many ways is a very similar campaign, actually, to the Eurosceptic campaign. And Alan was an historian, and I think had a sort of romanticism about the Anti-Corn Law League, who indeed were one of the most successful single pressure groups kind of the world's ever seen. But there were a group of us who persuaded him that the use of the word anti had modern connotations that just did not work, and that we had, in the wake of Maastricht being ratified, to become a political party. And in the end, he was persuaded of that. What was it like? Should we say, a band of glorious amateurs. Quite a lot of people with good academic degrees, with good brains, but hardly anyone that knew how to boil an egg. So lots of debate, lots of ideas, lots of interesting chatter, but when it came to actually running election campaigns, when it came to nuts and bolts organization, when it came to doing stuff on the ground, I mean, they were pretty hopeless, if I'm really honest about it. And part of the task from September 93 until June 99, when three of us got elected to the European Parliament, the biggest battle wasn't going out onto the street and having conversations with people, because actually people were quite keen to learn more, to understand more. the biggest battle in politics is often within your own party and not against the others. But we kind of, from 97 to 99, I was lucky in that we had a retired RAF squadron leader called David Lott, who actually could organise things, who actually could set up an office, give instructions to people, get things delivered through doors and make things happen. And so I worked with David, and in many ways, when I look back at all the highs and lows of 27, 28 years of doing this, in a sense, 3 of us getting elected to the European Parliament in 1999, that was almost the single most significant moment in all of this, because we had elected representation. Suddenly, a view was appearing on the BBC's Question Time. And bear in mind, there was no internet in these days. We had to rely completely on mainstream media to appear, to make our messages, to put the arguments out. And it was from that moment in 1999 that we were able to start pushing an argument that really had died with the referendum back in 1975. There was a campaign in 75 to leave the European Economic Community, but once that lost, that voice was almost not heard again in British politics for all those years.
Yes, I completely agree with that, by the way, because I was of the same opinion as you, and I was a strong supporter of the of getting out of Europe. But it didn't seem to be even halfway to being a practical proposition in those years. But something then, so we leap forward ahead to 2010. In that time, of course, you've been re-elected to the European Parliament, I think about 5 times. But between 2010, the Tory election victory, which put David Cameron with Liberal coalition partners into Downing Street, and 2015, most people seem to think those years saw somehow a breakthrough of some kind for Eurosceptic opinion, and in particular, of course, for the Brexit party. What do you think is the explanation for that?
Well, minor correction. That was UKIP in 2010. David Cameron becomes the biggest party in Parliament in the election, and of course forms that coalition with the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg. And what was clear was that it was a coalition that suited Cameron, because he wasn't a Conservative anyway. There's almost nothing about David Cameron that's even vaguely Conservative, economically, socially, or anything else. And it was from 2010 that UKIP grew in the polls. One day it was 3%. And then a few weeks later, it was 4%. And a few months later, it was 5%. And we kept growing and growing and growing. And I was leading the party. I was spending hardly any time in London whatsoever. I was out round the country. I was out in the street markets. I was doing public events in town halls. I was making a noise with local media. I had a following building on YouTube and many other things, an appetite for what I was saying, what I was doing. And we had a Conservative government, a Conservative-led government that were pushing on with European integration, effectively. We're pushing on by allowing China to buy into our nuclear industry, to become, as they saw it, our key economic and strategic partner going forward. We had a Conservative government compulsorily purchasing land and putting up wind turbines all over the country. A Conservative government who, without a manifesto pledge to do so, completely redefined what marriage had stood for centuries and centuries and centuries. And a Conservative government who point blank refused, when it came to the proposition that we ought to have a vote on whether to stay part of what was an increasingly political union. So, in a sense, as leader of UKIP, I kind of had 2 things going for me. One, energy, enthusiasm, and exuberance that were probably unrealistic in terms of where the party was, but I just believed in it and I wanted to be proved right. But secondly, a Conservative leader who was flat-footed, tone deaf when it came to his own voters. So we just grew and grew and grew. And in 2013, we got to a point where Cameron then wanted to commit the Conservative-led government to getting involved in the war in Syria. And once again, a massive miscalculation with Middle England and everybody else. And it was in the elections of that year, in the local elections of that year, that suddenly UKIP got 25% of the vote in England. And we then went on to 2014, where we won the European elections nationally. And the real reason that in the end Cameron offered the referendum was this. Yes, he was terrified of the number of votes we were taking from him. But what really scared him were the people we'd started to take from the Conservative Party. And I'm talking about people, who'd been branch chairman in Tory associations for years. I'm talking about, up to 20 former Conservative members of Parliament who were joining UKIP because they thought this issue actually matters more than their bond and their tie to the party. But what he really feared were a mass wave of defections taking place in the House of Commons. Now, they did happen because Douglas Carswell, began the process. Mark Reckless followed. They resigned as members of Parliament for the Conservatives. And on points of principle, unlike almost anybody else in modern times, they submitted themselves to by-elections. I mean, fancy that, honour in politics. I mean, it's a most unusual commodity. And of course, they both resigned, both stood as UKIP, both won their seats. So Cameron was terrified. Cameron thought there'd be a wave of mass defections, and a little bit of intrigue here, which you might enjoy. Stuart Wheeler, the guy that invented spread betting. And Stuart, after being the biggest donor in Tory party history, joined UKIP, became my treasurer. And there were lots of gossip columns in the London Evening Standard and elsewhere, saying that Stuart Wheeler had been seen in a lunchtime restaurant drinking wine with a sitting Tory MP, you see. And this all led to this fear in David Cameron of mass defection. So I had a chat with Stuart about it, and we decided that he should dine as regularly as possible, as prominently as possible, in the best known haunts in the West End of London, with as many Conservative members of Parliament who would accept the invitation, just to kind of put the threat level. And I think looking back on it, the truth of it is that, yeah, there were a number of Tory MPs who thought this whole issue mattered so much that they might jump. But I think Stuart's lunching arrangements led them to feel that it might be a tsunami. So what Cameron then did was to say, right, we're going to box this dreadful bloke Farage. We're going to box him off. We're going to shoot the UKIP fox. And you shoot the UKIP fox by saying there will be a referendum. If we get a majority at the next election, there will be a referendum. And David Cameron believed that once he'd said that, I would cease to be relevant. I would disappear, the threat would go away. Because all he did was to legitimise the very thing that I'd been saying for the previous 20 years. So that's kind of how this all came about.
Well, that's very interesting, of course, but once the referendum is set and called and everybody mobilises for it, the politics moves from the dining table of the West End to the voters. And there are now new rules in which the people running the broadcasting organisations have got to give equal time. Now, everybody thought, except a few people, I think, that Remain would win, because the whole establishment and the international establishment and the great and good and the BBC and the culture and the big cultural organisations and universities, they were all on one side, and then on the other was in a sense yourself, a raggle-taggle group of people from various parties, but with heavyweights like Nigel, the former Chancellor, and Norman Lamont. But generally speaking, the tables were tilted in favour of of Remain. Why did that not work? What was the issue, in your view, that gave the victory to Leave?
You see, something happened. Something happened in 2004 that very few people at the time understood the political significance of. And this was an expansion of the European Union to include 8 and then 10 former communist countries. And of course, Hungary was one of them. And, you know, when it came in the end to Romania, for argument's sake, you know, the minimum wage in the UK was 8 or 9 times higher than the minimum wage in Romania. And suddenly all these people had untrammeled free rights to come and live and work and settle in the United Kingdom, and to earn money. And of course, what they were doing was sending it back to their home country. Now, you know, this is okay if a few thousand people do it. It's okay if a few tens of thousands of people do it. But when hundreds of thousands or even millions of people do it, suddenly it's not okay. And what we'd seen in a number of industries had been a flood of people coming very, very quickly, wages being driven down to the floor, communities changing almost overnight in unrecognizable ways. And the perfectly reasonable argument that I'd made since 2004 was that it's all well and good to have foreign labor and to have the ability yourself to work overseas, but you have to have some limit. You have to have some control over it. And it was immigration becoming part of the debate about sovereignty, the debate about control. That is what won the referendum. Because, you know, you can talk about sovereignty, you can talk about these concepts till the cows come home, and it will interest a certain proportion of the population. But for many people who are not particularly political, they're not interested. They don't want to know. They don't watch the news at 10. They don't buy newspapers. They just live their lives. But they could see that something was happening within their communities that needed to be dealt with. And that's why the turnout in the referendum was so much higher. You see, everybody thought Remain would win, and everybody thought the turnout would be in the low 60%. As it was, the turnout was over 73%, and Leave won. And I believe getting back control of borders was the key issue in that. And I want to just add, if I may, none of this is based on dislike or distrust or distaste of people who come from Poland or any other part of the world. But it was based on, I think, a pretty rational feeling and assumption that part of being a sovereign country is that you do control your borders and who comes into it. And if you've lost that, you're clearly not a nation state anymore.
I agree with that analysis. What has always amazed me, though, is why the other side was never able to develop an effective argument on sovereignty. In the main, they simply avoided it. But it was, as you describe it, your trump card, particularly when you added immigration to the mix.
Yes, I mean, look, what the other side did was to go for Project Fear. They went for Project Fear. They went for, if you vote to leave, you will lose your job. If you vote to leave, you will lose your house. If you vote to leave, I think David Cameron hinted there could even be a third world war. If you vote to leave, terrible things will happen to you. They couldn't make the sovereignty argument, because to make the sovereignty argument would to be admit they'd not told the truth since 1975. So quite tough to row back on that. But I noticed whenever the argument was on immigration, they were in trouble. they were in trouble. Not one person in that campaign from Remain made the positive argument that being part of this European Union is going to lead to a great, brilliant future. Just if you don't have this, dreadful things will happen. And I think actually I think Boris helped with this too. I mean, don't forget, Boris did come into this campaign. You know, he'd never been a Eurosceptic really before, but he did come into this campaign. And I think we were talking about becoming independent. We were talking about becoming self-confident. We were talking about reaching out to America, India, Australia, Canada, our friends in the world. I think ultimately, however the media tried to portray us, we were actually giving the positive message and they were giving the negative message.
Well, you won the referendum against the odds, and then you have 3 extraordinary years, 2016 to 2019, in which nonetheless the fate of Brexit seems to hang in the balance. The establishment rallies strongly against Brexit. The government seemed to be negotiating for Brussels as much as against or with Brussels. And there was this long parliamentary stalemate in which one constitutional trick was played after another to try to prevent our leaving. Now, that stalemate was broken by your victory in the European elections last year. It's only a short time ago, but it was an important moment. But let me ask you about the 3 years. For a start, what did Mrs. May think she was doing?
I mean, the very thought that Mrs. May should become the next Prime Minister was, of course, unthinkable. The morning we woke up after the referendum, and yet a few days later, it seemed like the only solution. I have to say, I tried to be as objective about Mrs. May as I possibly could be. She gave a speech in Lancaster House in the early part of 2017. And I listened to this speech. I was almost up on my feet, cheering. I mean, here was a Conservative Prime Minister uttering sentences, phrases, using words that I'd been condemned for 20 years. And here she was saying she was going to do it. So I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt for as long as I possibly could. Then doubts began to creep in. And then she came back in July 2018 with what was called the Chequers deal. Now look, she herself, of course, never voted Leave, she voted Remain. She herself, of course, was not a radical, but was a status quo type of politician. You know, she'd have backed Edward Heath, not Margaret Thatcher, back in the 1970s, if you understand what I mean. And she was surrounded by a civil service. You know, I suppose our version of the deep state, if you like, who were intent on subverting the process. She led us to a place of, and I mean this, complete and utter betrayal of all the promises she'd made to the British people. The question for me then was what to do. What to do. My former party, UKIP, which after 25 years had, and I'd packed up as leader, I'd done my bit. It had rather sunk into internecine warfare and flirting with sort of street activist extremism, shall we say. That clearly was no longer a viable vehicle with which I could fight. I then hoped that the Conservative Party itself would have the courage to get rid of this woman. And they had the chance. In December 2018, they had the opportunity to remove the Prime Minister who put forward this dreadful sellout. And you know what? They didn't have the guts. They didn't have the guts. So I thought, right, I'm going to form something completely brand new. I'm going to call it the Brexit Party. I'm going to get 1 or 2 good people around me. We're going to employ a whole load of people under the age of 23 who properly understand how the internet works. And we're going to set up an online political party where you join with a credit card, where you're kept in touch by email. I mean, really, a very 21st century concept of what a political party might be. We got it set up, we launched it. 6 weeks later, we had the European elections. We didn't just win the elections, we got 50% more votes than our nearest rivals. It was an astonishing victory. Something of which I will be, to my dying day, very, very proud of pioneering. And the message then was this to the Conservatives: look, you gutless, spineless, useless lot. You've got two choices here. Now, Mrs. May didn't wait. She didn't even wait for the results to be declared. She resigned as PM. So I thought, yes, good. We're on the right track. And then the message was clear, because by June of 2019, the Brexit Party was leading the national opinion polls for the general election. We were in the lead. And the message was clear. Either the Conservative Party adopt the very simple platform that a significant national vote has been taken that must be honoured, and if it's not, we will try and replace you as the Brexit Party, or you learn the message. And I think the truth of it is that Boris Johnson's election as leader of the Conservative Party was inevitable the day we saw the results of the European election. And there are many things about Boris's government that I could chat to you about and say that I'm not happy with, but thus far on Brexit, they are delivering. So I think what the Brexit Party did was to reset the agenda.
I think that's completely, again, I have to sort of agree with that. I would say that the two victors of the European elections were you. After all, you became the largest party in the European Parliament, paradoxically, and Boris, who became the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister. And then, of course, he holds an election later in the year. And in that election, you wanted an electoral deal, and you wanted also a realignment of British politics. You didn't get the electoral deal. Why? Because had you had that, you would have made certain not only that the Brexit parties had a dominant, a larger majority than Boris ended up with, which was a pretty large majority, and you would have had the certainty on the government side of the House.
You're absolutely right. At the end of the day, the Conservative Party is about the Conservative Party. It cares more about itself than it cares about the country. It cares more about itself than it cares about the electorate. It is there to survive for itself, to be a means of governing the country. And we finished up in an odd position. Boris had done a deal in October in Brussels that was blooming awful. It frankly wasn't much better than what Mrs. May had done, but he was putting a different spin on it. And I said, fine, you don't want a deal? Fine. I will stand against you in every seat in the country and expose to the nation how fraudulent this deal is. But then what happened, there was a sort of behind closed doors parley that went on. Where I said, look, if you promise that you will amend this deal to promise the British people that against the wording of this deal, that we will not be aligned to EU rules, namely that we will be free, and that the process will be completed in 2020, the back end of the process being completed in 2020, come what may. If you say that, I'm going to be very happy. And you know what? They did that. We shifted them again. They did that. And then, John, I faced a dilemma. Because if I'd stood the Brexit Party across the entire country, there is no doubt that in the south and the southwest of England particularly, that we would have hurt the Conservatives, allowed the Liberal Democrats to win more seats, which may well have taken us to the awful place of a second referendum. So I faced, in some ways, the most difficult decision that I faced in all these years of doing this, knowing that if I continued on that path, we might finish up with a coalition government with the appalling anti-Semite Jeremy Corbyn in charge and a second referendum. But at the same time, I couldn't accept the deal Boris had done in Brussels. So it was a very, very tense period of up to a week. But once Boris made some promises beyond the deal he'd done in Brussels, I then said, I've got no choice. I've got no choice here. I've got to put country before party. I've got to put the national interest above what we as an organisation will do. And that's why the next day I withdrew from all the Conservative seats. And, you know, the Liberal Democrats now admit it cost them at least 24 seats. So I think in many ways, I've done quite a lot for Boris Johnson, but provided he finishes off the Brexit process, I'm fine.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's clear that you gave him that majority quite surely, and at some loss to your own party, in at least in the short term. You made that decision, and of course Brexit party is not represented. But the other thing you wanted was a realignment of British politics. And I wonder if you haven't got half or a third of a realignment, because what you got was the defeat of Labour in what's called the Red Wall seats, safe Labour seats, where the Brexit party actually has got a lot of support. And I wonder whether or not in future elections those seats may not go back to Labour, but might be disillusioned with the Conservatives. And if that happens, is there going to be a move back to a party like the Brexit Party, which has some of the qualities of the Conservative Party, but not the ones that annoy Labour voters?
Those Red Wall seats, those voters that went and voted for Boris's Conservatives, they were not straight switchers from Labour. Nearly every one of those voters had voted Brexit Party or UKIP or even Referendum Party, going back way back to Jimmy Goldsmith. So there was I often joke that I was like a gateway drug for Labour voters towards the Conservative. The difficulty with realigning British politics is this. The first past the post electoral system in England is almost impossible to break. And when you get even close to breaking it, they just break the law against you. They just break the spending limits, and 3 years later, somebody gets a slap on the wrist. I've seen all of this over the years. Labour, what is interesting is this. Corbyn had taken Labour in a way left direction. Shades in a sense of what Michael Foot had done back in 1983. Although I think Corbyn was more extreme and more unpleasant in many ways than Michael Foot had ever been. Starmer is making an interesting start as Labour leader. There is a touch of Blair about him. He doesn't scare the middle classes in quite the same way. And I think even though they're a long way behind the Conservatives now, and the gap they have to make up is absolutely enormous, I do think we're going to see a bit of a resurgence of the Labour Party. And therefore, in those Red Wall seats, it is up to Boris to prove not just that he's delivered the Brexit that they want, but he's going to have to prove as well that he's got control of our borders, that he's stopping, the illegal dinghy crossings that happened in the Channel area. I mean, these kind of things matter to Red Wall voters. And then there's the economy, because at the moment, the state is taking over more and more and more of our economic lives. And ultimately, in 4 years' time, will that in County Durham have delivered greater wealth for people's lives? Or does the Conservative Party, and I know it's not easy at the moment, but does it need to think about how it can create new, fresh, free market enterprise that creates new jobs rather than taxpayers' money propping up older ones? I mean, and I'm not saying this is an absolute choice between one or the other, because they're clearly both very important. So I think in the end, Starmer will make those voters think again, because he's not scary. He's not, some sort of rabid Marxist. Look, the truth of it is this. With Brexit delivered, and with the economy in half reasonable shape, there is no reason why Boris Johnson's Conservatives don't win a big majority second time round. And history suggests that they should. So I think in terms of a realignment, maybe it's happened. Maybe that more working class blue collar vote, it voted for Margaret in the 90s. It then deserted the Conservative Party completely. It came to me. It's now with Boris. That maybe is the realignment. But in terms of a more radical, fundamental change in British politics, which I would like to see, I think the truth of it is that's some way off.
Well, as a matter of fact, you're correct historically, and I'd go back even further. The Tory party used to get half its votes from the working class from about the 1880s right the way through to the 1960s. So the old Tory party always had a really significant tranche of working class supporters. But I agree with you, really, that we've already had a realignment in two ways. One is that you've just mentioned, namely that a big group of Labour working class voters have joined the Tories, and the other is Labour has apparently lost Scotland, and if it doesn't regain Scotland, it is very hard to see how it can become a national party again, I think. So, yes, I think we're on more or less even terms there. Yeah, good. Let me now go back for a last question on Brexit. Do you think Britain will regain its sovereignty fully? You're fairly optimistic on that, I think. And should it perhaps also leave the European Court of Human Rights?
Yeah, look, I mean, the European Court of Human Rights was set up with the very best of intentions, wasn't it? You know, the post-war world, it was designed as an early warning system to stop the human rights abuses in Austria and Germany and parts of Italy that were seen. But of course, it's had to sort of find a job for itself over time. I think a new relationship with the ECHR is important, absolutely. Will we leave the European Union fully? Well, I'll say this to Boris, we jolly well better, or I'll have to put my uniform on again and come and fight you again, which I'd rather not have to do. No, look, I think by the end of this year, even if what we get is not perfect, I think it'll be pretty good. And I think we will be an independent sovereign country. If we're not, yeah, as I say, I mean, actually, seriously, joking aside, if we're not, then I will have to seriously consider what I do next. But I don't think the Conservative Party wants me to fight them again. I think I've given them too much grief over the years, and I think they understand that.
Yeah, so they've seen that movie before and they know how it ends. So that's big. Now, let me turn to wider things. And do you see Brexit as being part, as many people do, of the same phenomenon as Donald Trump's victory in the States and the rise of populist parties in Europe? I'll come back to Trump, but in Europe, is populism, in your view, a useful term? What are the populist parties? What do you think they stand for?
Well, firstly, on Trump. I mean, Trump himself believes he would not have been elected without the Brexit vote, which is perhaps one of the reasons why I turn up in Mississippi in August 2016 and appear on the stage with him, and then I was in America for much of the next few months. I attended all the debates. I was doing a lot of TV stuff over there on it. So, yeah, I think Brexit and Trump are part of the same phenomenon. Absolutely. Populism. Now, I'd never really heard the term populism, particularly until Manuel Jose Barroso used it about me in the European Parliament just over 10 years ago. This Farage bloke, he's a populist, as if, gosh, I must have committed some terrible mortal sin at some point in my life. Well, John, all I can say to you is that populism is becoming very popular. And if the populist surge is a demand that people living in towns and cities in their countries have a bit more direct control over their lives, want to restore functioning democracy against centralist bureaucracy, then I'm for it in every sense of the word. To me, populism is about the nation state being the essential building block through which we bear allegiance, pay our taxes, are prepared to stand up and defend in times of crisis. And that is what we feel part of. It's what we identify with. It is natural, it is normal, It is where 2 million years of evolution effectively has taken us. And what is false and wrong and unusual is to try from the top and impose upon people new flags, new anthems, new symbols, and ask us to pray to false gods. And that's how I see this. That is how I see this great battle. And I actually think that functioning democratic nation states who want to genuinely trade and cooperate with each other is a much more fruitful, constructive, enriching, and more peaceful way to proceed than the building of superstates. I genuinely do, and I feel that in all my heart.
I think a lot of people in Europe obviously agree with you. Obviously, you came to the defence, I remember, of Viktor Orban when he was giving speaking to the European Parliament. I want to ask a couple of questions here about the future of Europe, but let me begin by saying people do see a similarity between you and Orban, and I wonder if you see any similarity. And secondly, Orban is not for his Hungarian version of Brexit. He's for transferring powers back as far as possible from Brussels to the nation states. Is there any hope for that point of view?
Oh, absolutely none. No, I mean, it's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. I mean, the whole basis of the European project, ever since the Treaty of Rome, back in 1957, is ever closer union. That is what it's about. They want to build a superpower. The Orban thing, I've defended Viktor Orban more than once. When he's come to Brussels and he's had the mob screaming at him in the Parliament, and I've been sort of his sole defender. So that's happened more than once. I'll tell you a funny thing. There was a piece written in one of the French newspapers, and it was written about 10 years ago, and it said that Nigel Farage is the European Union's worst nightmare because he wants to leave the European Union. And the same journalist referred back to that comment and said, but Viktor Orban is an even bigger nightmare because he doesn't want to leave, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Look, I understand why a country like Hungary, with its history and with its geography, does not at this moment in time see leaving the European Union as a practical political thing to argue. Even way back in the early 90s, I thought, do you know what? We're an island. We speak English. We've got friends all over the world. We can do this. But even then I understood it was very difficult for many other countries. So the Orban demand that Brussels gives more power, gives more judicial independence, allows him to make decisions about universities or whatever else it may be. The more he makes those demands, and the less Brussels agree to them, the more popular Mr. Orban becomes with the Hungarian public. But all I will say is this: there comes a point, and I can't tell you when it is, but there comes a point when Hungarian voters reach the logical conclusion to this debate. That you can try again and again and again to improve something, to mend a relationship, to get it onto a fairer and more even footing. But in the end, even the most patient of people decide that divorce might be the better option.
I see that, and I wonder if you would say that applies not only now to the Visegrad countries and to Hungary, but also perhaps to some of the West European countries as well. Whether or not, what advice, for example, would you give to the Italian government, to President Macron, and how to deal with the reality of Europe, which is that increasingly it's a vehicle for German economic and political power?
Of course, and as we speak, the Germans have just taken over the 6-month presidency of the European Union, just sort of rather reinforcing the point you've just made. Look, I think there are two fundamental fault lines in the European Union. One is the north-south economic fault line, namely to say that the German-dominated currency has worked brilliantly for Germany, and arguably, in economic terms, has not been harmful to those countries, particularly the low countries around it. You can ask political questions, but economically, not been damaging to them at all. All relatively similar types of economies. For the South, it has been a catastrophe. So you have Europe divided north and south on economics, and then you've got Europe divided east and west on cultural issues. Viktor Orban's insistence about the importance of Christianity and the church within Hungarian society, his belief in protecting national identity, his concern, over the level of ethnic migration into Hungary, goes completely against what political figures are saying in Germany and France and Belgium and elsewhere. So these are massive splits that exist. I'm often asked the question, who's the next to leave? Who after the UK is next to leave? Well, it clearly isn't Hungary. But it could be Denmark, couldn't it? Because Denmark, reluctant to join the club in the first place, didn't join the club until the Brits did in 73, exempted themselves from the euro, exempted themselves from the European arrest warrant, exempted themselves from a number of military commitments. In fact, the Danes had more opt-outs than we did until we voted Brexit. So Denmark is one example of a country who, if they see that the UK has been a success, with Brexit, will be encouraged to go that way. And of course, if we're honest, much of the UK, of course, is a former Danish colony anyway. So I think, well, it's true, isn't it? So Denmark is one country that will very carefully weigh its options up over the next few years. But the other one, and this is the explosive one, is Italy. Italy, big country, over 60 million people, one of the founding states, the Treaty of Rome, back in 57 and all the rest of it. But it is clear that a country that has now had no growth for 20 years is stuck inside the wrong economic straitjacket. It simply does not work. We've seen the deindustrialization of much of northern Italy. There's also, and this point's important, I can go to parts of France and Germany now with you, or we can sit in a local bar or restaurant, if they're open, of course, but we can sit and meet local people. We could talk about Brussels, talk about the EU, and we'd find plenty of people very critical. We'd find some wildly in favour, but we would find a chunk in France and Germany who would say, look, guys, whatever its faults, it's better than what happened here between 1914 and 1945. All right? Quite difficult, I think, for people living outside that sort of Rhineland central belt, to understand just what two world wars, or three if you include the Franco-Prussian wars, between these countries meant. So there's always been a slight residual attachment to the concept in those countries, even if the practicalities are not loved on a day-to-day basis. In Italy, you will find none of that. None of that. There is no historical reason for the Italians to actually believe in this project. And so culturally, it is easier for an Italian voter to say, do you know what, we're done with this, than it is for a French or German one.
Nigel, thank you for that. I think this is very interesting piece of backdrop information. I want to turn briefly the conversation to Donald Trump again. I think you're the only European leader who predicted his victory last time, and you supporting him this time. First of all, why? Why do you like him? What does he represent? And do you think will he win this time? And if he does win, will he be able to govern? Because the resistance to him from the Democrats, but also from the never-Trumpers, has been a huge obstacle to his governing normally this time.
Yeah, look, Donald Trump is, in many ways, the least likely American presidential candidate you've ever seen. Capitol Hill is of no interest to him. You know, he's the real estate guy from Queens. He's a New Yorker. You know, Americans know that New Yorkers are very brash, and New Yorkers know that people from Queens are even brasher. And Donald Trump is this larger than life character who says what he thinks, comes from outside the box. I backed him because he had the right instincts. You know, Trump believes in a nation state. Trump believes in the rule of law. Trump absolutely believed that Brexit was an important brick out of the wall in this sort of bureaucratic globalist nightmare people were trying to build. Trump believes that the little man and woman running their own little business need to be given an even break and a chance to get on in society. And it's amazing. You know, I've watched many of the world's leaders over the last 20 years when they actually meet the public and engage with them. And normally it's a sort of, oh dear, oh gosh, here's an ordinary person. Well, let's shake hands for the camera. And the sooner we get it over and done with, the better. You actually watch Trump going out talking to ordinary people. Yeah, he may be a billionaire. He may be a billionaire with a gold front door in New York. But I do think he's actually got a connection and a feeling for those people. So I backed him for all of those reasons. And it was, for me, I guess, quite a big political and reputational risk to do so. But I did it because I believed it was right. He's had a devil of a job governing. You're absolutely right. Every obstacle you can imagine has been put in his way. And yet, the guy is resolute in the most extraordinary way. Does he make the odd mistake? Yes. Does he say the odd thing that as a supporter, I'd rather he didn't? Yes, of course. That's because he's a human being, not a robot. This is not somebody wound up at the back like so many career politicians. This is somebody out doing stuff. I admire what he's done in terms of foreign policy enormously. You know, the attempt to meet the North Koreans and things, I thought that was tremendous. I like to see an American president whose first instinct is not to drop bombs and go to war. I think that's actually a refreshing change from where we've been, both with Democrat and Republican institutions. And you know, here is a pro-nation state, pro-democratic, pro-United Kingdom president of the USA. I went to Tulsa. I went to the first rally in Tulsa a couple of weeks ago. I would say that I felt his campaign there was similar to the way his campaign was at the same stage in 2016. Not quite in the right place. Messaging perhaps not quite as clear as I would like to see. But I felt that the subsequent speech at Rushmore was much better, much more on the money. And I noticed that yesterday, Joe Biden has said that he's in support of significant defunding of the police. Now, the press can say what the hell they like about Donald Trump. But I put it to you that if the average American thinks they're going to let in a president who clearly is not fully in control of anything that's going on around him and could easily be hijacked by a hard left, anti-police, anarchist agenda that will make their streets less safe for them and their kids to live in, make defending their property more difficult, then I think Donald Trump actually can come through and win the hearts and minds of middle America. It doesn't mean they have to like him. I get it. I get his style. I get there are people who don't want to take him home to meet mum for tea on a Sunday afternoon. I get this. But this is not a popularity contest. This is a competence contest between who you think can best run America. So look, I know John, he's in a tight spot. He was in a tight spot 4 years ago. He spent much of his business life in a tight spot. Do not underestimate the resilience of this guy.
I don't do that, but I do ask a question which comes directly from your last remarks, which is this, that in both Britain and the United States at the moment, there is an astonishing outbreak of anarchy, which attacks in particular the symbols of of American history, the American founding, and in our country, of course, our greatest national figures, and indeed the cenotaph, which commemorates those who died in Britain's wars. I wonder here, I'd like to know what you think, obviously, but I particularly would wonder how best we can respond to that, because it's a very delicate operation to try to restore faith and confidence in our country's symbols without at the same time toppling over into attitudes on the question of race, which would alienate a lot of the people on our side.
I'm sorry, I just don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think this is I think you've just put the view that has terrified the Archbishop of Canterbury, terrified our police chiefs, terrified our political leaders, and now I see the England cricket team taking the knee before a game of cricket. Look, good leadership is the ability to say to people, just slow down a moment. Please think. If this campaign was about equality of opportunity and a society as fair as we can possibly make it, we'd be all behind people marching in the streets. But it's not. The Black Lives Matters movement, funded by some very shadowy billionaire figures, has clearly stated aims, which are to destroy capitalism, to destroy the nation state as we know it, to bring in all sorts of reparations for historical wrongs, and that actually what you're seeing on the streets is not a campaign for racial equality, but a campaign to destroy everything our nations have ever stood for. And we will fight for racial equality, but we will not, under any circumstances, defend the Black Lives Matters movement, its symbolism, or anything else. And all that takes, John, is moral courage. But the problem is, there aren't enough people with moral courage. And I wonder, you knew Margaret Thatcher going back all those years. I'm certain that Margaret would have addressed the nation in a national TV address and drawn that distinction that she'd have done it far better than me, but she'd have drawn that distinction. And otherwise, we are taking the knee, we are bowing down. I mean, when the police in London take the knee to an organisation that wants to abolish them, it's about time someone did something.
Well, I'm happy to be corrected because, though I don't think I was quite expressing the point of view which you rightly object to, but thank you for that very clear
Well, for
statement.
the purposes of argument, I made it.
Okay. No. Now, just two questions in which to end. Personal questions, really. One, you had a brush with death some years ago when a light plane you were flying in crashed. When people who have had these near-death experiences frequently come back very changed. I think most people who, outside people who know you from television, would say, well, you didn't seem to have changed much. Did it have an effect on you?
So my first brush with death was age 21. I was hit by a car on a main road. I was a pedestrian at night crossing, and I was smashed to bits. I then had, in my 20s, a spell with cancer. And then in 2010, yes, I escaped from the wreckage of a light aeroplane crash. And that's quite a small survivors club, that one.
Yes, it is.
There's a lot more don't make it than do. Yeah. I was convalescing from it, and everything was broken. And I was a bit smacked up, to say the least. And after 6 weeks of this, I was bored. So I went to the European Parliament and gave a speech there in which I said that if you thought that I was a challenge to you before, you'll find I'm fearless now. And you're right, big experiences quite often change people. I think in my case, the big experiences just made me more who I am than I was before, much to the anger and frustration of my opponents.
Nigel, you must have been on desert island discs.
Never. They've never asked me. No, the BBC have never asked me, which is a pity, because I think, and of course, I've made lots of mistakes, but I do think I've had a very interesting life, a very different life, and one that, one that could make a good Desert Island Disc programme, or indeed a podcast. O'Sullivan's.
By the way, I think the people watching the programme today will agree with what you just said. But I'm going to ask you the question they always ask at the end of Desert Island Discs, which is, if you were stranded on a desert island and you were allowed to take with you one book, which can't be the Bible or Shakespeare, what book would it be?
Have to be Wisdom, because one of the things about cricket, there are so many extraordinary things that happen within the game of cricket. The statistical variations of what can happen in a cricket game are as great, I think, as any sport that's ever been invented. And I could sit there and go through Wisdom, and I could look at the early test matches way back in the 1870s and 1880s up to the current day. And do you know what? That'd keep me busy for months.
So you don't agree with Lord Mancroft, who said that the British had invented cricket because, not being a religious people, they wanted to have some concept of eternity?
well, there are many that would say watching a 5-day game is like that. I don't know. It's something that I grew up with, and I loved from a very early age, and I still very much do. And one of the biggest things missing for me this summer with lockdown is the ability to go to Lords and the Oval and watch cricket, which I thoroughly enjoy. But cricket's rather Brexity, really, isn't it? Because you think about it, it is the New Zealanders, the Australians, and many others that play it. And of course, in India, the second most populous country in the world, cricket is the sport that dominates. And there are now cricket fields springing up all around Chicago, and cricket is on the up globally. And I hope Brexit Britain will lead the way.
Well, thank you. I know from previous conversations with you that, like all good politicians, like all important politicians, you have a rich intellectual hinterland. It's not you're not simply, as you said, politician whom you wind up at the back and he starts spouting the party line. So I hope on some future occasion we can have a conversation which goes into your intellectual interests in some depth as well. But on this occasion, we've had a terrific tour d'horizon of your political views and your analysis. I hope that, as Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in, he said war, I will say you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And therefore, I think we'll see more of you. Thank you very much for coming on this podcast.
John, great pleasure. Thank you.